What's going on, guys? It is Filmington, and in today's video we're going to talk about why, for the most part, in the MLB, rings don't really matter with regards to hobby values. And that's very different from how players are treated in the NBA and in the NFL, where NBA finals, championships, and Super Bowls are very, very important for hobby values. Not the case in baseball. Sure, there are exceptions, but for the most part, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. If you look at 2017, Alex Bregman and the Astros won the World Series. It wasn't baked in. They weren't the favorite, I don't believe, against the Dodgers. And with Bregman's values, they didn't really do a whole lot afterwards. In 2018, Mookie Betts won it all, and Betts' values didn't really do a whole lot. They were flat afterwards. In 2019, the Nationals were a big underdog, even heading into the World Series, and Juan Soto's values were flat for a couple months till the hype started to build towards the next season. In 2020, you look at the Dodgers, Seager and Bellinger, their values didn't do much. Kershaw's a little bit of an exception, we'll get to that later. And in 2021, most recently, Freddie Freeman, his values were pretty much flat after the Braves won the World Series. And again, it was a time where it wasn't really baked in because the Braves weren't the favorites. So why do rings not matter in baseball? With regards to hobby values, obviously they matter for a lot of people. Just with regards to the hobby, it doesn't matter a whole lot. So first of all, I think it is because baseball, as opposed to football and basketball, there's more distribution of opportunity. It's more evenly distributed across the players on one team. So if you look at the NBA, you've got players that dominate possession, they dominate minutes, perhaps they have more shots, they just have more action time versus some of the other players on that team. You look at the NFL, it is kind of skewed because there are different positions, and let's just say that there are some positions that are perceived to be more important than others in football. With baseball, it is pretty evenly distributed in that, the lineup 1 through 9, everybody's going to get between 4 to 5 plate appearances or at bats in any given game. If you look at it through a series, maybe 15 to 25 on average, players will get at bats. Sure, there are certain players that will get more at bats than others, but for the most part, it's pretty close. And it's not a given that your best player, who often hits in the number 2 spot or number 3 spot, is going to get more at bats than everybody else on that team. And if they do, it won't be by a whole lot. Now, if you look at pitchers, now, yes, there are some starting pitchers that get more innings than others. That has decreased over time with the way pitchers are being used. And also, they're still not really pitching more than once every 4 or 5 days. If you go back over the last decade, yeah, there's been some playoff series where pitchers have kind of abused that. I think Bumgarner, CC Sabathia, for the most part, that's changed. And the hobby doesn't really like pitchers anyway, so why are we even talking about them? Relief pitchers, for the most part, they're not really going to get a whole lot of innings, and the opportunity is very distributed across them. Now, again, back to basketball, where there are some players that certainly dominate. If you look at the last 10 years worth of MVPs of the finals, it kind of shows you that it's usually a top player on that team that wins the MVP. That certainly gets that spotlight. And just going down the list of the last 10, Giannis, LeBron, Kawhi, Durant, LeBron. Iguodala was a little bit different in 2015, where you could argue maybe Curry was a better player, at least in the regular season. Then you have Kawhi again, LeBron. So maybe not the best player on the team is getting the MVP, because you'd argue like, okay, Anthony Davis was pretty good in the year where LeBron won it with the Lakers, and maybe the couple years where Durant won it, Curry was perhaps just as valuable in the regular season, one would argue. But for the most part, it's the best player or a top 2 player. It's a superstar that's winning that award. So you see how that opportunity in basketball, it's more concentrated across the superstars. It's concentrated across a fewer number of players. If you look at the last 10 to 12 years in baseball, if you look at the World Series MVPs there, you've got Ben Zobrist as one name, Steve Pearce, Jorge Soler, David Freese. Okay, these guys aren't bad. They're great in most cases, role players, utility players, but they're not the superstars of that team. It's not who you'd expect to win. And I think that's why, if you look at the Vegas odds, in advance of championships. With baseball, you don't really get anybody that's like lower than 8-1 or 10-1 odds. If maybe a pitcher's lined up to go 3 times, maybe that could be an exception. They could be 5-1. But in most cases, the stars are going to be between 10 to 20-1 odds. Whereas with basketball, you're going to see 2-1 or less for the stars, on the better teams especially. 2-1 odds, if you can even get that. In football, the quarterback of the stronger team, you're probably going to get 2-1 or 3-1 odds for football as well. So that kind of leads us nicely. It's a nice segue into the second reason why I think that rings don't matter in baseball with regards to the hobby. We talked about opportunity being distributed. Also, accountability is more distributed in baseball than in the other sports. So if you look at picture Mike Trout if he was to make it to a division series, best of 5, would you actually expect Mike Trout to be the difference maker, to make an impact in that series? If the series was 7 games long, if the series was 5 games long, which DSs are, if the series was, if it was a 1-game wild card playoff, would you expect Mike Trout to be the difference maker? And I would say probably not, right? So that's another key difference, where in basketball, you'd expect a guy like LeBron to be a difference maker. He would be one of the reasons, or a key reason, why his team won. Kawhi Leonard, same thing, if you go down the list of MVPs. Now with football, this is where it's a little bit different than basketball, because often, the Super Bowl is 1 game, right? It's 1 game. So this is why this happens, where the quarterback of the better team will usually win the MVP. But in many cases, if you go back 10 years, you've got Von Miller, Malcolm Smith, and Julian Edelman, right? They've kind of had outlier games because you got a smaller sample size, 1 game instead of best of 3, 5, or 7. But in most cases, if there's not an outlier performance from one of those guys, it'll be Eli Manning or Joe Flacco, Tom Brady, Nick Foles. Kind of an outlier, but he was the quarterback of the better team, right? You have Mahomes, you have Brady 3 times over the last 10 years. So with football, it's almost like the success of the team, it's attributed to the quarterback. Whether it was really, he helped with a game-winning drive, but it culminated in a field goal, and it wasn't the game-winning points from the quarterback that led to the win. Or maybe it's a receiver that makes a really lucky catch. Ultimately, the quarterback is going to get blamed for the loss and is going to get the credit for the win. That's just kind of how football works, for better or for worse. So again, we talked about opportunity being distributed, and also accountability is distributed as well. And you can kind of see that by looking at the different MVPs of those final series, the Super Bowl, NBA Finals, and the World Series. It's just a different sport. They're all team sports, and one could argue that baseball is lesser of a team sport, but it still doesn't negate the fact that opportunity is distributed across a greater number of players, and so is accountability. Now, there's always going to be exceptions. You can look at Derek Jeter and the 5 World Series rings he had. Yes, that ultimately led to him building a better Hall of Fame resume, which impacts his hobby. The ability for him to get all but 1 first-time votes. That's obviously going to help his hobby. So in that case, the World Series rings, yes, it did indirectly help his hobby, I would argue. Look at some other guys like Buster Posey. He might not end up getting to the Hall of Fame, but the 3 World Series that he won, that helps him kind of build a compelling case, which will help his hobby, I believe. But for the most part, getting 1 or 2 instead of 1 or 2 instead of 0, it's not really going to help most players' hobby, and that's why you don't really see an impact for most of these guys that are winning these World Series. Now, Clayton Kershaw, that was an example of a guy that rewrote his narrative. He was a guy that was known to choke in the postseason, kind of wear down, let his team down, and the fact that he won his first one, I think you saw his hobby establish a new floor. So I would argue that Clayton Kershaw, that World Series mattered to him and really to nobody else on either side in 2020. So that's it. Hopefully you liked the video. I mean, at the end of the day, guys, Mike Trout, it would be great if he won a World Series ring, but I don't think it would really benefit his hobby that much in the long term. I really don't. Ken Griffey Jr., if he had won one, I don't think his prices would be any different than they are today. Hopefully you liked what you saw. Let me know if you disagreed, if you liked anything I had to say, or if you did not. Comment down below. Take care, guys. Filming to note.